Hello, my name is Andrew Nash. I'm based at the Institute of English Studies in the University of London, and I'd like to begin by thanking Scott and Michael for inviting me to participate in this network and to speak about the topic of publishing revival and renaissance. It's helpful to me to be following Charlotte Lauder's wide-ranging presentation on periodicals and magazines at the first seminar, because any consideration of publishing, especially in this period and in this context, can't be reduced exclusively to the bound book. I will be focusing on both book and periodical publishing in this talk, but I'll be placing a little more emphasis on the business and editorial structures of publishing, as well as larger questions about authors and literary marketplace in the period from around about the 1880s, 1890s to the end of the 1930s. And my talk is guided by a structural observation that underpins the way publishing in Scotland, or perhaps it's more appropriate to say publishing and Scotland, has been viewed within narratives of revival and renaissance. And that is the valorization that has been afforded those publishing initiatives that promote, aspire towards, or lay claim to an indigenous literary culture of authors, publishers, and readers. And that whole idea of indigenous culture, which was floating around in the discussions at the first seminar, obviously relates to wider cultural and political questions concerning the nation state. But within the context of publishing, it relates very closely to the idea of London as the main publishing centre in Britain in this period, 1880 to 1939 or thereabouts, and to the perception within these arguments that a Scottish revival could only take place in opposition to that London-centric publishing culture. And this narrative is in part, I would argue, a reaction to the changes in Scottish publishing that took place in the second half of the 19th century, when most of the large successful firms that had led the way in 19th century publishing, such as Blackwood, Blackie, Nelson, Chambers, and later Collins, either opened offices in London or moved their whole editorial operations south. Now, many of these, including Nelson and Collins, retained their printing operations in Edinburgh and Glasgow. But the drift south inevitably came to be seen as part of an increasing Anglicisation of Scottish culture. Emblematic, perhaps, is the fate of Adam and Charles Black, which moved its offices from Edinburgh to London in 1889, 1 year after having completed a monumental 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, issued over 1875 to 1888. And it was expressly the belief that the Britannica could be better administered from London that prompted the move south. And when the publishing and selling of the encyclopedia passed at the end of the century to the London Times, it seemed to confirm a shift in power in the publishing industry and a decline of Edinburgh as a publishing centre. And this very much contributed to the sense that by the end of our period in the 1930s was absolutely dominant. That in the 20th century, the old established Scottish firms had lost connection with Scotland and Scottish culture. And it is true, of course, that in terms of literary publishing, we don't tend to associate the major Scottish firms of the 19th century and the early 20th century with supporting a revival in Scottish literature. Take, for instance, William Blackwood and Sons, who in the 1890s were responsible for bringing Galt back into print, evidently on the back of the success of Cailyard fiction, in a collected edition in 1895, and also issued the works of Neil Munro and later John Buchan and many other writers, minor writers, that formed part of a revival of historical fiction in the late 19th century. And of course, between 1925 and 1930, Blackwood issued Hugh MacDiarmid's poetry volumes. But the reason we don't associate Blackwood with revival in this area is, I would argue, twofold. Firstly, because revivals and renaissances that set out to forge new directions in art and culture are always more likely to issue forth from small business concerns. The business models of larger publishers mean that they are always more inclined to adapt existing products to known and tested markets, rather than to experiment without anything radically new, and rather than to try and create a new market. It's indicative, perhaps, that in 1925, MacDiarmid fails to persuade Blackwood to start a new magazine called Scots Art. And the other reason why we don't associate Blackwood with revival in this era, I would suggest, is because of its strong association with imperial markets. And later, during the First World War, its association through Blackwood's magazine with wartime propaganda. There is, with Blackwood, a sense of a grand old organ of the Scottish Enlightenment having gone over to a pro-British, pro-imperial outlook. And the same might be said of Thomas Nelson, whose very large operation at the end of the 19th century was based mainly on the supply of cheap books for export markets, and certainly not focused on a native literature. And specializing as they did in educational and religious books, it's inevitable that Nelson would be drawn to international markets, especially the lucrative colonial market. Nelson retained its printing works in Edinburgh, as I've already mentioned, but by the end of the century, the editorial business was conducted in London. And like other publishers of its size, it also had an office in New York and agents across the world, especially in the colonies in Australia, New Zealand, and India. And this opens up a question about how we assess the success or failure of Scottish publishing, and in particular, the internationalism of Scottish publishing in this era. Because as John Buchan, who became an editorial director of the firm, reflected in his autobiography, on the eve of the First World War, Nelson was a progressive, outward-looking publisher, operating editorially in London and New York, but printing most of its books in Edinburgh. And Buchan's words suggest some conflicting ideas of Scottish internationalism in this period, insofar as it relates to publishing. For all the evidence of a Scottish business with a cosmopolitan outlook and a large international reach, Buchan is clearly talking about something different from the internationalism that MacDiarmid, for example, was identifying as reflective of the distinctiveness of Scottish culture, and therefore to ideas of revival. And I think it's this association between the major Scottish publishers, Blackwood, Nelson, Collins, with British and imperial markets that created a climate where the main engines of cultural production emanating from Scotland or with Scottish roots were perceived by a new generation of writers to be catering for a market that was outside Scotland and inimical to Scottish cultural imperatives. As an illustration of this in a highly satirical and humorous form, we can take Lewis Grassic Gibbon's essay Literary Lights, published in the compendium of essays and creative material that Gibbon compiled with Hugh MacDiarmid in 1934, entitled Scottish Scene. Now, I don't want to pay overdue attention to the argument that Gibbon puts forward here, because it's something of a throwaway remark, and the essay from which it comes is concerned principally with the matter of language. But it does capture, albeit in a very extreme way, the terms upon which ideas of revival and Renaissance were built in the 20th century. His remark about Scottish publishers and about London publishers carries several assumptions. Firstly, that Scotland lacks distinguished publishers of its own. Secondly, that Scottish literature and Scottish readers are an alien market for London-based publishers whose focus is predominantly, if not exclusively, on an English market. And thirdly, that Scottish writers must make concessions to this market of largely English readers if they want to get published. Now, this remark, though it has a lot of mileage, leaves no room for a multiplicity of markets and for an interplay between the local, the national, and the international in literary publishing. And it also leaves no room for the possibility that Scottish editors and publishers working in London firms might have an interest in facilitating the work of Scottish authors and with promoting Scottish literature within a larger national and international literary marketplace. And one of the ironies here is that only a few months after Scottish Scene is published, Gibbon becomes friends with a person who I will come back to by the name of Alistair Patterson, who is working for the London firm of Routledge, and unfortunately cut short by Gibbon's early death. He enters into an arrangement where it looks possible for a period of time that a London publisher will actively sponsor the kind of writing that Gibbon and other writers of the Renaissance are wanting to produce. So the two propositions I've just mentioned, that there's no room for the possibility that Scottish editors and publishers working in London firms might have an interest in facilitating the work of Scottish authors, and that there's no room for a recognition that there was a multiplicity of markets in this period and an interplay between the local, national, and international. These two propositions are not usually admitted into narratives of revival or Renaissance, which understandably have pushed the argument that the establishment of a strong publishing culture in Scotland was a prerequisite for, or an outcome of, a literary or cultural revival. And without wishing to dismiss the validity or power of that argument, because it clearly does hold up well against the evidence, I do want to problematize it a little, because I think close attention to the publishing context of revival and Renaissance can help free us from some of the constraints that are imposed by the inclination to view with suspicion cultural production emanating from London, and to grant automatic cultural authority to any evidence of an indigenous publishing tradition. For one thing, closer attention to publishing context can challenge our tendency to think of literary movements or traditions, especially those associated with revival or Renaissance, as isolated from each other or in conflict with each other, rather than part of an overlapping local, national, and international publishing ecosystem. Take as an example two formulations, and I'd rather think of them as formulations than movements or traditions, of the late 19th century. The Celtic Renaissance, associated with Patrick Geddes, and the Evergreen and the Cailyard, associated with the publishing and editorial activities of William Robertson Nicoll. And it's important to emphasize at this point that the literature that came to be associated with the term Cailyard was viewed at the time in terms of a revival of Scottish fiction. In the 20th century, as we know, that fiction and the publishing and marketing strategies that surrounded it came to be viewed negatively as an example of Anglo-centric forms of cultural production, and so a tradition that needed to be dismantled if a revival or a Renaissance was to take place. Now, leaving the problems inherent in that view to one side, it would be easy to look at the different characteristics of the publications associated with Geddes and Nicoll and conclude that they illustrate ideas and cultural forms in conflict. Nicoll's publishing strategies rooted in London, advancing a British and imperial outlook, commercial in their structure and targeting a mass market, and having longevity invariably being held as signifying a form of cultural stasis in opposition to the fleeting expression of new and radical ideas. And Geddes's activities appear to be very much the opposite of that. So the argument goes. But when accounting for Nicoll's contribution to this particular revival of Scottish literature, it's easy to overemphasize the importance of the British Weekly, established in 1886, and overlook the importance of the Bookman, a literary periodical set up by Nicoll in 1891, which was hugely influential in shaping an understanding of British literary culture of the period, one that placed Scottish and Irish literature at the centre rather than the margins. And the Bookman gave wide coverage to the Celtic revival and provided an important outlet for revivalist writers, Scottish, Irish, Welsh, and Manx. It reviewed Geddes's publications and his own writings, and included features on Fiona MacLeod and other writers associated with the Celtic revival, such as Catherine Tynan and Nora Hopper. MacLeod's On the Hills of Dream was reviewed by W.B. Yeats, and Yeats was one of the main contributors to the Bookman to most of the early numbers, the early first dozen or so numbers. Far from absorbing Scottish and Irish writing into English literature, the Bookman actually profiled the distinctiveness of national literary developments in this period. The news notes section, for example, which opened its pages, was split up from January 1892 into separate English, Scottish, and Irish sections. And later a separate section was added for America as well. And it's also the case that the bookman was very actively engaged with European literature, with reviews and features on continental writers. So although the bookman and the evergreen were different kinds of publications in material and commercial ways, and in their geographical base, both promoted Scottish and Irish literature as part of wider British and European literature. And the fact that it was Victor Branford, a member of Geddis's editorial team, who wrote a lengthy 4-column review in the Bookman of the Evergreen's second number, shows how interconnected the publications were. And the overlap between the two periodicals is evident too in the Evergreen, as we see here from Geddis's own manifesto for the Scots Renaissance, published in the first number, which evokes both Barry and Crockett, as well as the all-pervasive strain of regionalism in literature across Britain. And it shouldn't be forgotten that Crockett was a contributor to the Evergreen, hardly surprising given his particular interest in nature and pantheism. What I'm getting at here is that the success of the Bookman demonstrates that a London-based periodical issued by a London-based publishing firm, devised and edited by a London-based Scottish man of letters, could be a critical and creative platform for the debate and dissemination of ideas of Scottish and Irish and pan-Celtic revivals in the wider context of British and European literature. And this interplay between local and wider British and international markets can be seen elsewhere in the period. In her presentation for the previous seminar, Charlotte rightly drew attention to the importance of the Paisley printer-publisher Alexander Gardner. And I would agree that Gardner is a neglected and underappreciated figure in Scottish publishing. But it's important to note that in addition to his printing operation in Paisley, from the 1880s, Gardner had an office in Paternoster Row, in the heart of the London bookworld. And the Scottish Review, which Charlotte highlighted, was distributed internationally through publishing agents in North America, the colonies, and the continent. Gardner simply wouldn't have been able to do that from Paisley. He needed an office in London to take advantage of the network of wholesalers and international distributors that enabled the periodical to be disseminated as widely as it was. And by the 1890s, it's evident that the American agent was handling subscriptions in the US. And so the magazine was to some extent circulating and distributing independently in North America. So for a significant Scottish publisher like Gardner, publishing books of Scottish interest and on Scottish topics for local and national markets did not mean publishing in isolation from wider British and international markets. Even those books that might be seen to be very specialist in their concern carried that Paternoster Row address as well as the Paisley address. So if Gardner and the Scottish Review are to be seen as part of a revival of Scottish periodical publishing in the late 19th century, it was a revival that was part of that Anglo-centric London-based publishing industry, which was in fact a global publishing network that MacDiarmid would later identify as inimical to Scottish cultural concerns. Hence my suggestion that it can be helpful to free ourselves from the constraints of thinking solely within those terms that MacDiarmid forcefully presented. And interestingly, in the new century, Gardner appears to become less international in its operations. Title pages generally include only Paisley as a place of publication. And this may suggest that the market for specifically Scottish books had become less viable in the ever larger global marketplace in the early decades of the 20th century. By the 1920s, Gardner was in fact closer to the kind of publisher that MacDiarmid wanted. And Charlotte rightly drew attention to MacDiarmid's recognition of Gardner's importance on his death in 1927. Gardner's books were sometimes advertised in MacDiarmid's Scottish chapbook. Indeed, an advertisement for William Souter's anonymously issued volume of verses, Gleanings by an Undergraduate, appeared in the same issue in which MacDiarmid reviewed the book favourably. Souter was one of the poets that MacDiarmid had anthologized in the final volume of Northern Numbers. So I want now to move on to consider some of the publishing contexts of the interwar literary renaissance. Publishing, in its broadest sense, can be understood as the process whereby texts and ideas are made public, i.e. they reach audiences. And what ideas of revival in this period have in common is an interest in unlocking new audiences. Much of MacDiarmid's complaint about Scotland in his critical writing of the 1920s is levelled at the audience for art and literature and for the tastes and policies of Scottish publishers and reviewers. In the Scottish Nation on the 18th of September 1923, he outlines the prerequisites of a Scottish literary revival, which include establishing better standards of literary journalism in Scotland, encouraging writers to address the distinctive characteristics of Scottish life and letters, but the necessity over and above these of securing media of publication, the timeliest creation, in short, of an adequate public. And certainly for a period in the early 1920s, creating a new audience for a literary revival involved for MacDiarmid and others establishing a whole new industry of magazines, editors, and publishers. Of course, the publishing context of MacDiarmid's critical and creative writing, his critical writing in particular, are so varied that they can't be reduced to a neat summary. But there are trends. And broadly in the 1920s, there's a dominance of smaller outlets, little magazines, small presses, or self-publication. Illustrative of this development are the three volumes of Northern Numbers, the anthologies of living Scottish poets that MacDiarmid edited between 1920 and 1922. The first two volumes published by Tian Follis, the final volume published by MacDiarmid after Follis, in financial difficulties, had to pull out. And the difference between these modes of publishing is illustrated in the title and copyright pages of these books. The Follis volumes displaying a commercial reach across and beyond the UK, MacDiarmid's volume displaying the characteristics of local production. And it's visible too in the advertisements at the back of the volume. MacDiarmid here taking the opportunity to advertise his new venture, the Scottish Chapbook. And the Chapbook, which was highlighted in the previous seminar, has rightly been seen as both a landmark and an influential force in the interwar literary revival. I always like reproducing the back cover of the very first issue, which carries an advertisement for a fountain pen endorsed by Harry Lauder. I'm sure MacDiarmid enjoyed that particular irony. The Scottish Chapbook was the first of several publishing ventures which MacDiarmid was able to produce over 1922 to 24 because he could make use of the printing facilities of the Montrose Review, on which he was at the time a reporter. And self-publishing obviously gave Christopher Grieve greater freedom to drive forward his own agenda, as well as providing a critical forum for his own creative work as Hugh MacDiarmid, who was introduced in the third number of the Chapbook. As he commented in a letter to Helen Cruikshank, commercial conditions didn't weigh in the Scottish Chapbook in the same way as they did with Northern Numbers, which enabled him to seek experimental work. And this phase of MacDiarmid's publishing activities associated with small magazines and self-publication is entirely consistent with wider developments in literary culture and literary modernism in this period, with the establishment after the First World War of new channels of cultural production through little magazines and small presses. It's not at all the case that self or coterie forms of publication were the only channels through which ideas of literary revival were promoted in the 1920s. As Glenn Murray has argued, and as those wonderful volumes of uncollected prose in the Carcanet edition prove, MacDiarmid was adept at manipulating all forms of media. But it's not unreasonable to suggest that in a publishing context, the interwar literary revival was a local affair in the 1920s, but by the 1930s had become more visible south of the border. As an illustration of this, take the following exchange between the publisher Macmillan and the poet Lawrence Binyon from 1928. Binyon acted as Macmillan's informal advisor on poetry publishing during this period. And when the firm received an approach from MacDiarmid proposing a publication of a golden treasury of Scottish verse, they approached Binyon for advice. It's quite an interesting story, this, because Binion actually suggested that Macmillan should consult J.C. Smith, Inspector of Schools, or Professor Grierson, both of whom knew McDermott and might well have written in support of the venture. But the key thing to note is that in 1928, neither publisher nor expert poetry advisor were aware of the recent developments of Scottish poetry, and the proposal was rejected. Yet just over 5 years later, in March 1934, MacDermott signed a contract with Macmillan for the Golden Treasury of Scottish Poetry, which was not eventually published until 1940 because of MacDermott's ill health and difficult living conditions, which impacted on his ability to work on the project. But the episode begs the question of what had changed between 1928 and the mid-1930s. Evidently, the revival had become more visible beyond Scotland, and London publishers had become more interested in the topic of Scottish literature. We can see further evidence of this in two other examples. Firstly, in the collaboration between Faber and Faber and the Porpoise Press. Porpoise Press was founded in 1922 by George Thomson and Roderick Watson Kerr, two Edinburgh University students who, like Christopher Grieve, were part of a younger generation of writers seeking new publishing outlets for their work. And they published a series of poetry pamphlets, rather misleadingly called broadsheets, because they weren't broadsheets in the bibliographical sense, which included MacDermott's The Lucky Bag in 1927, and subsequently issued longer volumes of poems by Marion Angus and others. By 1930, the press had passed into different editorial hands and had grown to include fiction and non-fiction, including Neil Gunn's collection of short stories, Hidden Doors, and a new impression of Grieve's Annals of the Five Senses. But the decision to enter into partnership with Faber in 1930 was on paper an ideal arrangement, because the editorial side of the business was supposed to remain independent under the direction of George Blake and George Thomson, with Faber handling production and distribution, always the most challenging elements of publishing for a small operation. But the working arrangement and the contractual terms was actually quite different. Although the Porpoise Press volumes continued to carry Edinburgh on the title page, the terms upon which the partnership was set up effectively put control in the hands of the Faber directors, who had veto over editorial decisions. And added to this was the fact that neither Blake nor Thomson had much time or commitment to the press at this stage in their lives. As Blake commented at the time, the idea would have been for a new company capitalised in Scotland and having complete power over the decision, with Faber was the internal name for Faber, remaining as distributing agents and no more. And in his study of the Porpoise Press, Alistair McCleary reads the fate of the press as an inevitable outcome of the loss of agency that occurs when Scottish publishing operations are transferred to London. Yet while the arrangement was flawed from the outset, I think you can look at it from the opposite angle and conclude that Faber's continued support for the press indicates something, at least, about London publishers' interests in Scottish literature in the 1930s. The main reason it was kept going was the success of Gunn's novels, especially after Morning Tide had been named a Book Society choice, which took the Porpoise into more middlebrow commercial markets. If you read McCleary's exhaustive account of the press, you can really appreciate the sheer effort of Frank Morley at Faber to keep up the imprint, even when its putative editors Blake and Thomson were showing little interest in it. Here, in Grasset Gibbon's parlance, I would argue, is an alien publisher, but this particular alien wasn't wholly disinterested in Scottish literature. And the Porpoise-Faber arrangement is not the only example of a Scottish literary renaissance in London in the 1930s. When George Blake sold his shares in Faber to T.S. Eliot, the man who had hoped initially to acquire them was Faber's sales manager, a Scot named Alistair Patterson, who promptly left Faber and took up the position of sales manager at George Routledge & Sons in 1934. And it was because of Patterson that Routledge, for a short period in the 1930s, attempted to specialise in Scottish books. Paterson was a friend of Macdermot's and an acquaintance, or became an acquaintance, of Brassett Gibbon. And together, the three men devised the Voice of Scotland series, the collection of books that included Edwin Muir's infamous Scott and Scotland. And as is known, Macdermot was hired on a retainer to seek out books on Scottish topics and to read submitted manuscripts. There was even talk at one point of setting up a separate imprint under Routledge for Scottish books, a separate Scottish press. Paterson was the man who saw Macdermot's Scottish eccentrics along its troubled path through the press, and also sadly had to pick up the pieces of the unpublished Red Scotland. And I think we can see Paterson attempting to pull off the kind of thing he would have seen George Blake fail to pull off at Faber. Ultimately, I suppose, you could view his effort to bring about a Scottish Renaissance in London as a failure. He spent just over 3 years with Routledge before retiring from publishing, reportedly due to ill health. As with Blake's failure to make the Porpoise Press work as a subsidiary of Faber, it was as much to do with the thwarted efforts of individuals as it was anything structural about publishing tastes and policies. If Paterson had been wealthy enough to have purchased a share in Faber's business, or to have become a director of Routledge rather than just sales manager, although in practice he was a lot more than that, then the fate of Scottish literature in the 30s may well have been different. What I think the example of Paterson shows, and there's a lot more we need to know about him, is that we can learn a lot about the publishing context of revival and Renaissance if we look not just at the motivations of authors in seeking to place their work in particular outlets, but also at the motivation of publishers, especially London publishers, in responding to, and in the case of Routledge, attempting to contribute to a revival or Renaissance. There remains, I think, much work to be done in this area.